Most people will probably miss this monument, which is in the middle of Aschaffenburg. It's in the form of a children's game, which is known in German as Heaven and Hell. But if you look closely, you'll see that it's made from the title page of a medieval book called The Hammer of Witches. Now, roughly where I'm standing, there was a tower which was part of the city's fortifications. It's since been demolished. But during the course of the 17th century, around 320 women, men and children were brought here, tortured, forced to confess to witchcraft, and either beheaded right here or taken out of town and burned at the stake.
And it wasn't just witches. There was an awful lot of collateral damage as well. I'm on the trail of the Dragon of Dieburg. In 1485, a Dominican monk called Heinrich Kramer failed in his attempt to get a woman called Helene Schäuberin convicted of witchcraft, apparently because she objected to his constant sermons about witchcraft. So, in the following year, he published The Hammer of Witches, a book in which he blamed women for the fact that he was obsessed with sex and explained how he thought witches should be dealt with. At first, the book was condemned by leading theologians who held belief in these things to be a superstition, but a century later, the church had started a relentless campaign.
In the first 3 decades of the 17th century, in the electorate of Mainz alone, nearly 1,900 people were executed for the supposed crime of witchcraft.
Life in those days was tough, and people wanted an explanation for natural disasters and disease. They were looking for a scapegoat, and the Hammer of Witches gave them one.
Most fortified towns in this area have a tower which is called the Witches' Tower, and Dieburg was no exception. But according to my information, Dieburg's Witches' Tower was actually demolished to make way for this hospital. I wouldn't mind, but the hospital went out of business years ago, and nothing much has happened since.
Now, the man known to history as the Dragon of Dieburg was called that because his surname sounded like the German word for dragon. Lorenz Drach was a bell ringer and coppersmith by trade and had the misfortune to be living just when the witch hunts were really starting in earnest.
So this is the kind of thing that you tend to stumble on in places like this. According to the plaque, that house was owned by a man who, along with his entire family, fell victim to the witch hunt.
Hundreds of people from Dieburg were accused and about 60 were executed. Now, that may not sound like much, but you have to remember that the town was much smaller in those days. 60 people was a huge proportion of the community.
It's impossible to overstate the level of hysteria. In one case, a victim loudly protested that his confession had been tortured out of him, and that in any case belief in witchcraft was nothing more than a superstition, upon which he was beheaded. My source doesn't make it clear whether he was beheaded on the original charge of witchcraft or for witchcraft denial. Either way, it was a terrible time to live in.
One of the earliest to be accused was Drach's wife, who, together with 3 other women, was taken to Büdingen to be incarcerated there in early 1598, although she was then released. Drach and the other women's husbands protested and wrote a text in which they lampooned the trials that were taking place.
Well, since I can't actually show you the Witches' Tower because it no longer exists, the next best thing apparently is the Mill Tower.
For this, the men were themselves arrested and accused of plotting to kill the Archbishop of Mainz. And so they were taken to Aschaffenburg, the second city of the electorate of Mainz, and at some point between then and March 1604, executed and quartered. We can't be sure about the date of Drach's execution because any records there might have been no longer exist. There are only vague references that were written years later. But that we have an account of him and his wife is thanks to a man called Anton Praetorius, who wrote a book opposing the witch trials. He was motivated by stories like Drach's, a horror that he felt should never be repeated. But his book was published in 1613, and it would be another 20 years before this mass insanity, driven by fear and ignorance, would finally come to an end.
Wow, it's hard to believe that there was a time when people thought that this kind of architecture was acceptable.